Topic name is Bayes formula and updating probability estimates. Learning outcome is calculate and interpret an updated probability in an investment setting using Bayes formula. In finance industry, we often make a prediction and we often assign a probability to that prediction. But based on the updating information, that probability can change. Based on the updated information, that probability can go up and it also can go down. For example, you have predicted that interest rate will go up in the future, and on the arrival of the inflation number, your probability of the interest rate going up can change. It can go up. It also can go down. So Bayes formula is a rational method for adjusting our viewpoint as we confront new information. And this formula is used in many businesses and especially the investment decision-making techniques. So Bayes formula updates the previous probability of any event. So if you have predicted previously that the chances of interest rate going up is 60%, but now on the arrival of the inflation number, you are almost sure that because the inflation number are higher, so you are almost sure that interest rates are really going up. So the updation of this probability, for example, the new probability is 95%. So using that Bayes formula, you will calculate the new probability of the old event. So Bayes formula helps in decision making process. It will help you to update the probability of the previous event, which previously you have assigned a different probability, but based on the new information you will assign a new probability. Given a set of prior probabilities for an event of interest, if you receive new information, rule for updating your probability of the event is as follows. So this is the Bayes formula. In the numerator you will put probability of the new information given the event. Given that event, what is the probability of the new information? Divided by unconditional probability of the new information into the prior probability of the event. So for example, if the prior probability of rising interest rate is 60%, you will put 60% here. So you will put probability of the event. This is the probability of the prior probability of the event. So when there is no new information, the probability of the interest rate rise was 60%, you will put on the numerator. Then second is, given the event, what is the probability of the information? So if the interest rate will rise, what is the probability of inflation? You will put in the numerator, and in denominator you will take the total probability. This probability of information is a total probability. Total probability of inflation. So in order to remember, because we will learn it in detail, but obviously you know that in CFA exam it will be tested through MCQs. So remember, on the right side you will always put old probability of the event. So on the right side always put the old, the prior, the existing probability of the event. So in my example, event is rising interest rate. So you will put the probability of rising interest rate here. Okay. And in the numerator, it is given the event. What was the event? Rising interest rate. Rising interest rate. Given the event, given the rising interest, if interest rate rises, what will be the probability of the inflation? Why inflation? Because new information is inflation, and divided by the total probability of the new information. So here you will multiply prior probability of the event, prior probability of event, And in numerator, given the event, what was the event? Rising interest rate. Given the event, what is the probability of new information? And in denominator, you will take the total probability. Remember, total probability of the information. So that is the base formula. So the answer will be probability of the interest rate event given the information. So remember, here you will put probability of event, here you will put the total probability of the information, here you will put given the event, what is the probability of information? Answer will be probability of the event given the information. So let me explain it with example. Assume there are total firms 500, tech firms are 100, non-tech firms 400. So what is the probability of tech firm? 100 over 500, 20%. And what is the probability of non-tech? 80%. Okay. If there are 100 technology firms, 60 of these firms has a return greater than 10%. So tech firms are total 100. 60 firms has a return greater than 10%. And 40 firms has a return less than 10%. So just explaining an example. Okay, the non-tech firm, 400 firms, and out of those 400, 100 firms has a return greater than 10%. 300 firms has a return less than 10%. So if I ask you a question, very simple question. How many firms are there? How many tech firms whose return is greater than 10%? 60. What is the probability? Probability of return greater than 10% given these are tech firms. Given these are tech firms, so there will be 60% chance, 60 firms out of 100, their return will be greater than 10%. Okay, and given it's a tech firm and return is less than 10%, that is 40% obviously. And given if it's a non-tech firm, what is the probability of achieving return greater than 10%? So 400 firms non-tech, 100 firms are generating return greater than 10%. So 100 over 400, 25%. So the last will be 75%. Non-tech return less than 10%. Okay, now I am asking a very important question. What is the probability of achieving return greater than 10%? What is this? It's a total probability. Okay, let's solve it. So you want to calculate total probability of return greater than 10%? Yes, sir. So probability of achieving return greater than 10% if you're a tech firm, that is 60%. And what is the probability that you will be a tech firm? 20%. Plus, what is the probability of achieving return greater than 10% believing that you are a non-tech firm? Into probability of non-tech. So that is 25 into 80%. So in total that will be 32%. By the way, you can also calculate directly. It's very simple. Total firms, 20% chance that it will be a tech, 80% chance that it will be a non-tech. Okay, if you're a tech firm, 60% chance return greater than 10%, 40% chance return greater than less than 10%. If you're not tech firm, 25% chance that return is greater than 10%. So I want to calculate the total probability of return generating than 10%. So what you will do, multiply, I want to calculate the total probability of this, multiply 60 into 20, multiply 25 into 80 and get the total. That will be the total probability which we have covered in the last reading. Okay, now I want you to calculate very important information, that is probability of tech firm. Probability of tech firm given the return is greater than 10%. So try to calculate it. You have the full information. So I want you to calculate return probability of tech firm given the return is greater than 10%. Okay, you will say, sir, total firms are 500, 100 firms are tech, 400 firms are non-tech, 100 into 60, 60 firms of 60 tech firms who are generating return greater than 10%. And out of these 400, 100 firms, 100 are non-tech firms who are generating return greater than 10%. So that means total firms are 160 who are generating return greater than 10%. And out of those 160, 60 firms related to the tech firm. That is 37.5%. Okay, if we want to calculate this using Bayes formula, how to calculate this? Remember, the Bayes formula is probability of prior probability of the event into given the event, what is the probability of the information, divided by the probability of the information. So your answer will be probability of the event given the information. So I want you to calculate, this is 37.5%. I want you to calculate that, okay, there is 20% chance that your firm is a tech firm. Okay. So I want you to calculate if your firm is generating greater return than 10%, what is the probability now that your firm is a tech firm? So the question is, if company is generating return greater than 10%, what is the probability of being tech firm. Okay, so that means you again want to calculate the tech firm probability, but now given the return is greater than 10%. So you want to calculate probability of tech firm given the return is greater than 10%. Okay, start with the what is the prior probability of the event. So the event here is being tech firm, 20%. Given the event, what is the probability of the information? So given the event is tech firm. What is the probability of the information? Information is return is greater than 10%. So let me search, given the tech firm, what is the probability of return greater than 10%? So given the tech firm, what is the probability of return greater than 10%? That is 60%. And in denominator you will take the total probability of the information. Information here is return greater than 10%. So what is the probability of return greater than 10%? That is 32%. So let me solve it. (37.5%). So base formula will help you to calculate this, will help you to update your prior probability. So remember the formula, always take on the right side probability of the event, always take given the event, remember this, given the event, what is the probability of new information, divide by the total probability of the information. Okay, the next example is you are an investor in the stock of Drive Med. Positive earnings surprises relative to consensus EPS estimate often result in a positive stock return, and negative surprises often have an opposite effect. Drive Med is preparing to release last quarter EPS, and you are interested in which of these three events happened. Last quarter EPS exceeded the consensus, last quarter EPS met the consensus, last quarter EPS fell short of the consensus. So probability of EPS exceeded consensus is 45%, probability of EPS met consensus is 30%, probability of EPS fell short of consensus 25%. Okay, now we will consider this later. The next day, Drive Med announced that it is expecting factory capacity in Singapore and Ireland to meet increased sales demand. You assess this new information. The decision to expand capacity relates not only to the current demand, but probably also to the prior quarter sales demand. You know that sales demand is positively related to the EPS, so now it appears more likely that the last quarter EPS will exceed the consensus, so our focus will be on this. So the question you have is, in light of this new information, what is the updated probability that the prior quarter EPS exceeded the consensus estimate? So we will apply the base formula. Firstly, we will take the prior probability of the event. Event is probability of EPS exceeded consensus. Okay, what is the new information? New information is Drive Med expands. So here we will take the probability of Drive Med expand, and here in the numerator we will take the probability of the new information given the event. So the event is EPS exceeded and probability of new information. New information is Drive Med expand. Okay, the answer will be probability of EPS exceeded given Drive Med expand. Okay, we have the prior probability of EPS exceeded, that is 45%. Okay, now if the EPS exceeded, what is the probability of drive med expand? If the EPS exceeded, what is the probability of drive med expand? That is 75%. Now we want the total probability of the drive med expand. Okay, probability of EPS exceeded is given, probability of EPS met consensus is given, probability of EPS fell short of is given. Here, if EPS exceeded, probability of drive med expand is given. If EPS met consensus, probability of drive med expand is given. If EPS fell short of consensus, probability of drive med expand is given. So we want to calculate the probability of drive med expand. First outcome, if EPS exceeded consensus, 45% chance, and if that happens, drive med will expand 75. If EPS met consensus, 30% chance. If that, in that case, probability is 20%. Plus, if EPS fell short of consensus, 0.25% chance. If EPS fell short of consensus, probability of drive med expand is 0.05. So we will take the total of this. So the total probability will be 41%. So let me put it in the denominator. So 0.75 divided by 0.41 into 0.45. The updated probability is 82%, approximately 0.8232. 82%. That's the updated probability that if drive med expand, the EPS exceeded the expectation is 82%. And this is in reality the case, because in expansion EPS will increase. Answer will be probability of the even given the information. An investor in APCO stock forecast the probability that APCO exceeded, met or fell short of consensus for free cash flows during the prior quarter. FCF exceeded 50%, met 35%, fell short of 15%. While waiting for the APCO to release last quarter FCF data, investor learned that APCO will acquire a competitor, believing that upcoming acquisition make it more likely that last quarter FCF will exceed the consensus. The investor generates a list of FCF events that may have influenced the acquisition. So, probability of acquisition if exceeded the consensus, met consensus, probability of acquisition, fell short of consensus, probability of acquisition. So, using the base formula, calculate the probability that APCO is likely to exceed consensus for the last quarter given the acquisition. So, you want to calculate probability of FCF exceeded consensus given the acquisition. Okay. What was the last probability of exceeded consensus? That is 50%. So now in the numerator you will put probability of acquisition given the exceeded information. Probability of acquisition given the exceeded information, that is 40%. And in the denominator you will put the total probability of acquisition, and you will calculate total probability of acquisition using this. Total probability of acquisition is equal to probability of acquisition given the exceeded information 40 into probability of exceeded information 50% plus probability of acquisition given the FCF met consensus into probability of met consensus plus 0.15 into 0.35. So what is the total probability? That is 0.15 into 0.35, 0.25 into 0.35 0.4 into 0.5 plus all these 0.34. So 0.4 divided by 0.34 into 0.5, that is 58.82%. B is the answer. An analyst has established the following prior probabilities regarding the company next quarter EPS exceeding equally or below the consensus. Several days before releasing the earnings statement, the company announces a cut in its dividend. Given this new information, the analyst revises his opinion regarding the likelihood that the company will have EPS below the consensus estimate. He estimates the likelihood that company will cut the dividend given the EPS exceed, meet, or fall short. It's exactly the same question. So analysts thus determine that the unconditional probability for a cut in the dividend is equal to 23.75%. So examiner was kind enough that he has given us the total probability of the cut in dividend. So using the base formula, calculate the updated probability that the company EPS are below the consensus. So we will calculate probability of EPS below the consensus given the cut in dividend. So what is the probability of below the consensus? 20%, that's the prior probability. Now, given the cut in dividends, we want to calculate, given the cut in dividends, what is the probability of EPS? Now, if probability is below the consensus, what is the cut in dividend? 85%. And the total probability is 23.75%. So what is the total result? 85 divided by 23.75 into 71.57, that is 72%. Beta B is the answer.